All right. Don't panic. You know, you saw Edison in the title of the video. You're already worried about what I have to say. You know, we're not starting any wars today. You know, that's not what today's video is about. There's no secret that I am not a fan of Edison format. But I wanted to say, I think it's very fair to say that a lot of my viewers do pay attention to both Edison and Tengu, or even try to juggle both. And honestly, I feel like currently there's probably a lot of scenarios popping up for a lot of people where the following happens. You know, you're at your local tournament store, you're playing Edison format every week, and then suddenly someone comes in and goes, "Hey guys, can we give Tengu a try?" And you're sitting there thinking, "Oh, I just invested in Edison format, man. I don't want to spend money on a whole nother format. It's way too much," you know? And I think that's a fair and genuine concern, right? So because of that, I wanted to make this video, which basically is just going to showcase you how similar the card pools between Edison and Tengu really are, and just kind of teach you how you can cost effectively transition between Edison and Tengu plant format. So I'm going to show you guys the top 5 decks that I personally think smoothly transition from Edison format to Tengu plant format. So not necessarily completely new decks or anything like that, just the decks that I think you could cheaply add a few cards to and then have it effectively play in Tengu plant format, as well as still be a strong contender in Edison format. So we're going to talk about those decks that kind of smoothly transition between the two, as well as I'm also going to go over 5 decks that I think are very cheap to invest in the Tengu plant format if you want to keep it separate. If you want your own Tengu plant-esque deck that is really cheap to pick up, I got you covered on that too. So I'm just trying to showcase how easy and cheaply you can do this, so it's not putting a strain on your wallet to play multiple formats, especially if you're genuinely interested in playing both. That's kind of, you know, where we got to be at. So let's break it down. Let's get into it. We'll start with the decks that can go from Edison to Tengu, so let's hop right into that. All right, so full disclosure, I'm not really going to cover much about side decking because I feel like side decking is up to the individual player, so we're not going to pay much attention to what's down here. These are just what's pre-built on these decks I have on Dueling Books, so I wouldn't worry too much about those. So we're just going to talk about strictly what the main deck is, what you'd have to really purchase to transition between the two, and yeah, we'll just kind of go from there. So in the number 5 spot, this is probably the least optimal out of them all, but still honestly probably fine, is going to be like Machina / Ancient Gear. This is the build I've kind of tampered with a bit, and it's basically just like the minimal core of Ancient Gear with a Machina engine and then Thunder Kings. It's almost like a stun or control type deck, and I honestly think this deck is not bad. It hasn't performed poorly for me at all, mostly because Ancient Gear Beast is really good in Tengu plant format, and it's also pretty strong in Edison. The ability to swing over a monster and negate its effect, like, you know, in Edison killing a Raikou, or in Tengu killing a Tengu or a TG monster, can go a really long way. So I think this card's really strong. And then honestly, Machina Fortress never really goes down in value as a boss monster. It's always like relatively good. So this deck is like pretty strong. The one thing that I dislike about it in terms of a cheap transition is I feel like Thunder King isn't really a mandatory card in Edison format. I feel like it's not as commonly played as it is in Tengu. In Tengu, it's borderline a staple in a lot of decks. So I would say that if you already have Thunder Kings because of Edison format, then this is a very cheap and easy transition. You know, the only cards you're really going to have to buy outside of the Thunder Kings, if you don't already have them, is going to be 3 Dualities, 2 Solemn Warning, a single copy of Monster Reborn, a single copy of Dark Hole, and then 1 extra copy of MST if you don't already have them lying around. I mean, this card was reprinted how many times? But yeah, those are going to be the main cards in the main deck. And then, you know, in extra deck, most of these synchros aren't relevant. You're not even running tuners, so I would say that the only other card you're going to need to purchase is going to be Roach and Utopia. Exceeds are playable in Tengu plant format, but it's a very small pool, so like there's only 3 rank 4 Exceeds that are playable in this entire format, and these are 2 of them, and the third one is Wind Up Zenmeister, which you just wouldn't need for this deck unless you're opting for something like Limiter removal. Then you could maybe do a bit more damage because Zenmeister is a machine, but that's kind of up to you. I would say for the most part, you would just need these 2 cards here. So in total, buying these cards, I'll put the price for it up on the screen, but it's honestly extremely reasonable. It's not that bad. So editing Tyler here, I just realized that Roach is like, that Steel Form Roach is like $5 or something for a super rare. That's like the cheapest you could go on it. So I'll be honest, I'm going to go ahead and say that you do not need this card unless you absolutely want it. It is nice for certain matchups. I would say pick it up as a one of. But, you know, if you don't want to go spend that kind of money, it is not necessary at all. I would just have a couple rank 4, so maybe 1 Roach, 1 Utopia, or you could just max out, do like 3 Utopias. It's really not that big of a deal, but Roach is nice to have if you want it, but, you know, it is a little pricey. That's the number 5 deck. This is, like I said, probably the least optimal out of the few. In my personal testing, it's gone well. I think it'd be completely reasonable to full send this deck in a tournament, and also, you know, there's different iterations of this deck in Edison format. I'm not saying that this is just hard exactly how it's played in Edison. I mostly am just trying to focus on the Tengu builds and be like, hey, most of these cards are in Edison as well, you know, just show the similarities, because there's different builds for every type of deck in Edison. So yeah, that's kind of how it is. But yeah, that's the first deck. Let's move on. We'll talk about the next one. All right, coming in the number 4 spot, we have Vayu Turbo. Now, this is a popular deck in Edison format, and honestly, I don't have a lot of concrete, like, you know, tournament results to show that this deck is strong, but I personally, in my personal testing, I found this one strong. Just so you guys know, the next 3 on the list have seen tops in Tengu Plant format, so they're a bit more reliable. But, you know, I know a lot of people are a fan of this deck in Edison, which is why I just want to show, like, hey, this is still playable in Tengu. I would feel more than comfortable playing this deck in a tournament, no issue. So the only, like, real cards you're going to need to pick up for this deck that makes it a little different is that this deck kind of plays off of more a chaos route in Tengu Plant format, just because you have the likes of Effect Veiler and you have access to more chaos monsters. This is really nice because your whole graveyard becomes a resource, and that feels really strong. But yeah, the only cards you would need to pick up, you need the 1 BLS, you need the 1 Chaos Sorcerer, a copy of Zephyros, mostly because this plays really nicely with Gale, and it's like millable off of Raikou. Back on Thunder Kings again, there's 2 in here. These are technically replaceable, you don't necessarily need them. You could maybe opt for Cyber Dragon or just throw like Gores or something in over it. I think they're still really good. So it's kind of up to you. Again, if you already have them, it's a no-brainer. If you don't, then, you know, that is slightly pricey. But once you have them, you have them. That's what's kind of nice about it. And then you have these 3 cards. You have Effect Veiler. Luckily, for the most part, in this format, you don't need Max C. I know, you know, if you haven't played this format before, you might be thinking, oh, like, if Max C is legal, I need to be maxed out on that card. It's not really the case. The card honestly underperforms in this format. It's pretty underwhelming. It's not insane. And I think, you know, even there's some decks that have completely topped in Tengu Plant format that aren't even running it. So I'm not going to sit here and say that it's like absolutely necessary. I will say Veiler is way better to pick up than Maxi, which is why I have Veiler at 3 in here. It's also a light for your Chaos Engine, which feels really nice. And Veiler is 10 times cheaper than Maxi. I think Maxi is like 20 for commons, and, you know, Veiler you can find for next to nothing. So we'll of course put the prices up, but, you know, then on top of that, you're gonna need a copy of Dark Hole and Monster Reborn, and then, you know, the extra copy of MSC, the 2 warnings, and yeah, that's about it. If we go into the extra deck, there's a copy of Utopia, and then we need a Trishula, because you are running tuners in this deck, so Trishula is actually relevant for this deck. And then Scrap Dragon is another synchro that I think is definitely worth running. But other than that, the rest of these cards all exist in Edison format, I believe. So yeah, I mean, not a crazy investment that you really need to worry about. So yeah, we'll again put the total on the side here. I think this deck is completely fine to run in a tournament. Again, it's a little less tested. The next decks we're going to showcase all of top, so we'll kind of get into those, and you can take a look and see what we have. Again, this is my 4th optimal choice if you just want something that's a pretty easy and clean transition. And I'd say this is relatively easy, given that you only need a few cards. All right, number 3. Now, again, this is a deck type that has seen tops. This is my personal list. I just really like it because I don't know. I like how it's played. The deck that topped is a little bit different, but I felt like my list was also pretty budget, which is why I'm just going with that. But yeah, we're going to talk about Zombies. So Zombies is already a top contending deck in Edison format. You see it splash around in a lot of ways. And in Tengu Plant format, I would argue that it is completely viable. It's definitely seen top, so definitely worthwhile and a pretty smooth transition. So once again, we'll kind of break it down. You would need 1 copy of BLS. We need an extra copy of Trigodia. And then you're going to need an extra copy of Goblin Zombie because of the fact that it's at 2 in Edison and 3 in Tengu. And then 3 tour guides, which is, you know, pretty standard for this deck. This is a really nice card to add into the deck. And then we'll do an extra copy of Card Trooper because I believe it's limited in Edison and it is semi-limited in Tengu. And then we need a copy of Glow Up Bulb, 3 effect failures, the Dark Hole, the Monster Reborn, the extra copy of MST, an extra copy of Call of the Haunted, the 2 Solemn Warning. And then going into the extra deck, this is where it goes, you know, we need Utopia, you need Leviathan Dragon, you need 2 Leviair because it is pretty good. And yeah, then the rest of this stuff is all, I guess you need Trishula and Scrap Dragon and then Librarian. These are all pretty good cards. Other than that, the rest are already existing in Edison. Again, this is another deck where the extra deck space isn't super tight, so I opted for siding Elemental Hero the Shining or maining Elemental Hero the Shining for Super Poly, but it's not a huge deal if you don't want to go that route. Other than that, that's what the deck is. This honestly might be the most expensive transition, but I do think the deck is strong, and I know a lot of people have zombies, so I definitely thought this one was worth mentioning. We'll put the total price here on the side again, but yeah, just so you guys know, going forward, I'm not going to continue putting the prices of every single card that shows up if it's already been shown. You know, we'll just put it in the total so you guys can get an idea. But yeah, that's number 3. I'd say this is a completely viable and strong deck. It's maybe a bit trickier than the other 2, but I don't know. I would say that this is a really viable deck. I think the biggest drawback it has is I think it's difficult to pilot and it's easy to misplay in Tengu Plant format. There's a lot of lines that are very specific. I learned this the hard way when I played it in tournament, where I underperformed, but looking back at replays, it seemed like it was because the deck just has a lot of very specific things you need to do at specific times. So it's not super easy to pick up, but it is very strong. All right, number 2 on this list. Now, I put this as number 2 because based on the fact of cost efficiency, right? So I base this list entirely on what is the most competitively viable as well as cost efficient. And in regards to heroes, I would say this deck is the most viable on the list. Like, this sees a lot of tops in Tengu Plant format. It's very popular and it's also very strong in Edison, right? So it's a easy no-brainer deck to run. The only thing that holds this deck back is going to be the 3 Thunder King. If you already have Thunder Kings as an Edison player, this is the best transition for you. Easily the best deck on the list to swap between to make sure that you are being as efficient as possible in terms of cost, and you can be competitively viable in both formats. That being said, since Thunder King is a staple in Tengu and less of a staple in Edison, like some people play it, some people don't, I don't want to operate under the assumption that everyone has this card, so this is being a $9 common. It's a pretty necessary 3 of in this deck, right? Like almost every build runs it. So yeah, the nice thing about the Tengu Plant version versus the Edison version is you kind of get to trim the fat on the deck. You get to remove a lot of the cards like, you know, Elemental Hero Ocean or whatever because you need card targets for absolute 0. In this deck, you have the Shining. So you just confuse with your lights, which means you really don't need to worry about adding a bunch of other stuff. And then basically you replace those cards with Pot of Duality. So if we're looking at the cards that you are swapping into Tengu Plant format that you would need to pick up and purchase, it's going to be, once again, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn. That's kind of a given at this point. Pot of Duality as a 3 of, you need 3 of those. Then the 2 Solemn Warnings. So that is about it, you know, excluding Thunder King, but we'll include Thunder King in the final price and without, as you've seen before. And then moving on to extra, then you need Utopia, maybe Roach. You could also double down on Utopia. We'll include it with Roach. And then 3 copies of Elemental Hero the Shining, 2 copies of Nova Master. This is another card that got released in Generation 4, so it's like basically a Tengu Plant exclusive. I'd say this card is worthwhile. It's not absolutely necessary. You don't even have a way to summon it via main deck. It'd be basically with Super Poly inside, but most hero decks side Super Poly, so it's relatively worth it. And then you would need, you probably already have the Absolute Zeros and maybe the Gaia, but we'll throw Gaia in there. I gotta check and see. Editing Tyler here. I just realized that Dragon Knight Draco Equesti is not in Edison format, so this would also be a card you'd have to pick up. I'll be honest though, it's not super important. This is like a super poly target and a very niche super poly target, so unless you're maining super poly, not a huge deal, but I wanted to include it. It's only like 15 cents anyway. But yeah, that's it. That's the whole transition. So that is probably the smoothest transition. Again, if you're not including Thunder King, this is the cheapest bang for your buck with the strongest deck. And then we'll move on to the final deck that I will say is the easiest transition by far in terms of budget, but is like, you know, maybe slightly less good than this deck. All right, before we go into the number one slot, I realized after editing this, I completely forgot about Frog Monarchs, and even though it's a little embarrassing, I didn't want to remake the whole video to fit this in, so I'm just adding this in as a quote-unquote honorable mention. Although honestly, you could make a case for this to be either number 1 on the list, number 2, even number 3, like somewhere in there. Like this deck honestly makes a ton of sense, so I'm honestly really sad I missed it, but at least I wanted to get it in the video because honestly, I just feel like this is a no-brainer, right? So we've got, you know, Frog Monarchs. I won't say that this is the most optimal build. I know a lot of people are opting to run like duality and stuff like that. This is just the example I have on my website, but I will say this deck has topped multiple times in Tengu plant format, so it's 100% viable to play. And honestly, like if you compare it, like the card pool is just absurdly close. You're going to need an extra copy of Tragodia, 3 Effect Veiler, a Ronin Totem, an extra copy of MST, the Dark Hole, the Monster Reborn, and that's it. If you want to add dualities into the mix, you know, I'll add a price with dualities in there too, you know. Going down to the extra deck, you need Gachis, you need Trishula, Scrap Dragon, and then the rest of these, I guess, Librarian and Formula. These are the only cards you're going to need to add in that are going to cost extra, but this might be the cheapest deck on the list that transitions smoothly because all these cards are already in Edison. You're basically just swapping out Substitute for Ronin Totem and then dualities or other consistency cards, right? Because I don't think 3 Battle Fader is optimal. I think you could cut these down, maybe do the duality. I don't know. There's a lot of different lists in the Tengu Plant Discord. We'll put a link to that in the description. But yeah, this deck is a no-brainer. As you can see, the price is absurdly cheap. So yeah, I just did the math, and this is far and away the cheapest one, so it even beats my number 1 slot, and I'll be honest, I'm embarrassed, but I'm man enough to admit when I'm wrong. So, you know, just full disclosure, this deck's probably number 1, but you know, we'll move on to what at the time I had picked as my number 1 slot, which is still a pretty good one. So, you know, we'll hop over to that. All right, believe it or not, this is the final deck on the list of easiest, smoothest transitions in terms of competitive viability. This deck is actually a deck that topped in the Tengu Plant Discord. It made top 4 of a tournament, and this is just Gladiator Beasts. But what I like about this list is mainer side, it was not running Max C, so this is one of the lists that have actually topped without running Max C, so that saves a ton of money. And then also it doesn't main Thunder King, which makes this extremely cheap. So the only cards you're going to need to buy to get this list and play it is going to be 3 copies of A Hero Lives, 1 copy of Dark Hole, 1 copy of Monster Reborn, 3 copies of Forbidden Lance, 2 copies of Safe Zone, and then 2 Solemn Warning. And then you move on to the extra deck, and honestly, it's not bad either. You're going to have 1 copy of Gladiator Beasts Esidari. I mean, this is just kind of a nice card to have. And then you need Leviair, Leviathan, Utopia, and then Roach. And again, we can supplement this. You don't necessarily need Roach if you don't want to go that route. I'll include the price with it and without it as well. But yeah, this, in my opinion, is the biggest bang for your buck. This deck, because it's seen tops in Tengu Plant format, I'm not going to say that this is far and away the most competitively viable. I think this deck is a bit harder to top with than like the likes of Heroes, for example. But I will say that because it saw success, it is fair to say that this is a competitive deck, and I know it's playable in Edison. A lot of people like playing Glads in there. So if you're a Gladiator Beast player, this is such an easy deck to play, to take to both formats, right? Like this costs almost nothing. I guarantee you the price is going to be very low when I total it together down here, but yeah, this is going to be my biggest deck. And now we're going to move on to a few decks that I think are really cheap to purchase if you want to go in the route of just buying something completely new. All right, for this part of the video, I'm not going to go over prices of literally everything. I'm just going to showcase decks that I personally feel are like strong decks that are really cheap to pick up. So like, if you already have a lot of the Edison card pool cards, it's not going to be much more of an investment to buy these things, but I didn't want to try to price out entire deck cores because that sounds super messy. So for this part, we're just going to rationalize it. The first deck I want to talk about is Girax. This deck is literally just a bunch of hidden arsenal cards, and for the most part, they're all like relatively dirt cheap, right? You got a couple Thunder King in there, which will drive up the price a little bit. Fossil Dig's been reprinted a million times at this point. And then you, of course, have like Forbidden Lance. Going into the extra deck, the Girax Synchros are super, super cheap as well. And then, you know, for the most part, all these cards just already exist in Edison format. So I think this deck has seen recent success, and I think it's honestly not that bad. If you play Flamvel in Edison, then this is kind of like a similar deck in a way. So, like, you know, you run 3 Rekindling, so this all transitions over. Honestly, not a huge impact of like moving from one format to the other, but I do think this is a pretty strong deck that's pretty easy to invest in. Probably shouldn't cost you more than like 20-30 bucks realistically, but again, that's just a rough estimate because I don't want to price out all these. So yeah, we'll move on to the next one. All right, moving on to the next deck I want to talk about, we have Gravekeepers. Now honestly, this is a deck that sees a lot of success in Tengu Plant format. It's really popular. I don't know if this build here is necessarily the most optimal, but for the most part, the reason why I like this deck as like a cheap and easy transition is you just gotta buy the core of the Gravekeeper monsters, and they're honestly not that expensive, and especially like Spy, a lot of them already existed in Edison. So I think this would be a pretty easy one. It's just that plus like trap cards. So it's like you buy one generic core and then a bunch of traps, and then you're good for most back row decks in the format. I think that's a pretty decent investment. The only thing that makes it a little pricey is again going to be like roaches in the extra deck, but for the most part, everything else is like extremely reasonable. So yeah, I think this would be an excellent option if you want to kind of play something new that isn't necessarily, I mean, this exists in Edison, but without Recruiter, it's like pretty fake, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, I would say that this would be a good option for you. All right, coming in at number 3 on this list, we have Psychics. This is one of my personal favorite decks in the format. I think it's very, very strong and a lot of fun to play. Super floaty, and most of the cards in this deck come common, so they're really, really cheap. Tengus aren't super expensive or anything like that. The most expensive card in this deck is going to be the single copy of Max C in the main deck, but again, you could swap that out. You could just run back row. You could run like a D Prison or something, completely supplement it. It'll be fine. But yeah, this deck is pretty smooth transition over. I mean, you're buying a lot of like small stuff, but again, it's all super cheap. You move on to the extra deck, there's a few niche cards that are going to be more specific. I mean, you have the Exceeds, but again, once you get the Exceed pool, you're good for most decks in the format. And then like there's Ultimate Axon Kicker and then Psychic Nightmare. These are 2 like very niche specific cards, and I guess TG Wonder Magician going from Tengu to Edison. For the most part, the rest are like pretty common, like commonly seen, and honestly cycling between the 2 outside of Scrap Dragon Trish, but these are dirt cheap as well. So yeah, I would say that this would be definitely a really strong option if you want something a little more unique to play. I think this deck is very, very strong. It's personally one of my favorites, but yeah. On to number 2, banking off the last deck, you know, where we had a little bit of TGs. This is just full sending on TGs. The entire engine is common, guys. Like you can get all this stuff for nothing. And I really like TG Stun, because if you opt for stun decks, then you don't have to opt for hand traps. So again, this saves a lot of money on, like, if you don't want to buy Veilers and Maxis. I mean, Veilers are pretty cheap if I'm being honest, but still, this is like this exact list or something very similar to it just won one of our largest Tengu Plant tournaments we've had. So it's definitely 100% still viable and strong. And again, it's a really, really cheap and easy investment. Nothing is like crazy expensive. Duality's virtually nothing. Horn of the Phantom Beast is, I don't think, very much, but yeah, it's a pretty easy pickup, and the extra deck barely matters in this. I mean, Trishula is probably the most important card because you can summon this pretty easily, and then like Wonder Magician, level 5s, maybe like level 6s as well, like your Bryanak and Barkion, if you want to go that route. But yeah, it's nothing too crazy. I'd say you do access the extra deck in this more so than other stun decks, but for the most part, you're just floating around with your cards and stunning them out with the likes of Skill Drain, and that's relatively good enough. All right, this is my number 1 deck on the list, and I'm going to be honest, you guys might probably feel sick of TGs, but TGs really just do be an engine in this format. Like, it's something you can run in various ratios to like supplement, and the thing about it is they replace tour guides, which makes them cheaper than other things, right? So like, tour guide isn't that expensive, as you guys saw. It's like $6 for for one of them, so like 18 for a playset. Nothing crazy expensive, but I'd still say that, like, you know, if you really want to go dirt cheap, then TGs are just going to supplement this better. It's really not too big of a deal, and honestly, I don't think you lose much on power. In fact, I personally prefer TG agents over regular agents with tour guide, just because I like having the striker to kind of reduce the amount of normal summons you need to have. Like, this deck actually has quite a few normal summons, but yeah, this deck is really, really strong. And honestly, because of Ghosts from the Past 2, they reprinted all the agent cards as ultra rares. They look amazing, and they're super cheap to pick up. So I would highly recommend going this route. My list also ran Valor over Herald of Orange Light, which is also really, really cheap. It's like you know, $1 for each one, so like $3 for 3 Valors. So you can go into this deck relatively cheaply. The only card that is expensive is, once again, Thunder King Ryo. But for the most part, there's nothing bad in this list at all. Even in the extra deck, it's pretty tame. I'd say like Ancient Sacred Wyvern is like slightly pricey, but you honestly don't need this. You could cut this if you wanted to. It's not a huge deal. It's just kind of nice to have. But yeah, that is going to wrap it up for the total decks, like all the different decks. If you want to play something that's like more specific to Tengu plants without spending a ton of money to invest in the format, these are some of the more niche specific archetypes that you could do. Moral of the story is, pick up the TG cards. They're really splashable, and they're really easy to run in different decks to make it function, right? So I would recommend playing TG or going for TG stuff if you're going to go for budget, because they just work in so many different things. They're really flexible cards, and they don't really take away from any of the engine. Like, for example, in this deck, it's really nice because you could summon Striker, normal Venus, get 3 Shine Balls. You can make like double Gachi. You can Trishula. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. So yeah, it's a really cool deck, definitely worth playing. But yeah, that is going to be it for my top 5 decks to play that are different from Edison. All right, lastly, I just wanted to cover a few side cards that are, for the most part, generically cheap that you could opt for. You know I said I don't want to talk about side cards, but I'll just show this because I feel like these are side cards, and I put them in here at the ratios you would typically see them in a side deck. And all these cards are really, really cheap. The exception to the rule is Max C. Like I said, I don't think you need this card. Most people side it. It is a very good side card against decks that special summon a lot, like Tengu plants, for example. But it's not necessary. You can opt to run other things and be fine. And then, so we're just going to talk about the first, like, the cards here listed. We got 2 Cyber Dragon. This is the common rare, like, ratio. It's at 2 in Edison. It's at 3 in Tengu. And honestly, you could bump this up if you want to, but most people just side 2 Cyber Dragon for Karakuri, with, like, Chimera Tech, stuff like that. Forbidden Lance is a really good side card against heroes in TG. I really like it, just, you know, as a nice tool to, like, it defends against, like, either Horn of the Phantom Beast in the damage step, or it's really nice against heroes because it puts them in an awkward spot if they have Gemini Spark. If you attack into them with a monster and they attempt to Gemini Spark, you can lance your monster and they don't get the draw. It's really good. Effect Veiler, if you aren't running any hand traps, this is probably worth siding. I'd say if you're not maining it, it's worth siding. And again, this is like the cheapest hand trap and probably the most necessary one out of any of them. And then Debunk is really nice if you're playing something that special summons a lot, if you're opting to play like Tengu plants or something, or going against a Chaos deck that's running like low back row and running like a bunch of Trags and Gores. This deals with that really nicely, so this is a good side card in. Same thing goes with Chaos Trap Hole, going against Agents, going against Chaos type decks, stuff like that. This is a really smooth card to side in. I personally am a big fan of it. It also hits a lot of the synchros that are used in Tengu plants. Leeching the Light is a common side deck card that goes against Agents, and it's also a common, so this is a very, very cheap card. Royal Decree, if you're playing a deck that, you know, doesn't want to deal with back row, so going into things like Heroes or TG, this will really help you deal with that. King Tiger Wangu, this card walls off almost all the normal summons in both Tengu plants and Agents, which those are pretty popular decks in the format, so this is a really strong card and also dirt cheap. It's like a common, it's nothing. And then we have 2 Puppet Plant. I would definitely wouldn't side 3, but this is really nice, especially if you're running the plant tuners like Spore, for example. Puppet Plant is a super nice card against heroes. You can just steal their monster, then summon a tuner and synchro with it, Exceed. I think in general, stealing opponents' monsters in this format is really, really powerful because Exceeding exists, so I would highly recommend siding these. Again, all these cards are dirt cheap. If you're not already maining or siding 3 MST, like you definitely want 3 MST between main and side, usually in 90% of decks, so I put these in here at 2 because most decks are maining at least 1, usually 2. And then D-Prison, this is the side card for things like Heroes and stuff like that, or like TG if you need more removal. And then lastly, Light Imprisoning Mirror. If you're going against agents, this could be another potentially strong card. But I would say for the most part, you could side any combination of these cards depending on what deck you're going for. If it's more back row oriented, obviously you're going to cut Decrees, side in MSTs as counter sides to Decrees, and then put in extra back row stuff. So like you might want the Dimensional Prison, the Chaos Trap Holes, even the Lances. Those are all really good cards. If you're more combo oriented, then you probably want the Decrees. You probably want the the Puppet Plants, the Veilers, the Debunks, the Lances, stuff like that. So just to give you an idea of how you typically side in this format. But yeah, this is a pretty, it's generic, but it's a pretty solid guide on what you could approach like with your side deck, and also do it in a very budget way, because honestly none of these cards are expensive. Again, if you want to go Max C, they're like $20 a common. This is probably the most expensive card in the format. Once you have them, you have them. But I will say they are not necessary if you don't want to spend the money. So guys, that's going to be the most cost-effective way to transition between the two different decks. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys, showing the prices, stuff like that. So it gives you kind of an idea of how you can do it and show you just how similar the card pools really are. So it's not that bad to like switch between the two, and it's not a massive investment to try to play both formats if you want to go that route. But that being said, I do want to say that Tengu Plant format really doesn't have limits in terms of what's playable. There is so many viable decks in the format and so much more to explore. So if you're interested in exploring a bit more, looking a bit deeper, and seeing what all is out there in Tengu Plant format, you can go to my website, tcgrewind.com. Up in the top corner, you click Formats 2011, and it'll show all the decks that are playable in Tengu Plant format, so you can take a look at all the different decks that are available to you. It gives you a really good example of starting points for deck lists, which is really, really cool. And then lastly, if you want to find out more information or ask more questions, you can join the Tengu Plant Discord. I'm in there myself. You can ask me questions there, or just ask the community, and people are always more than willing to help out new players. There's so many different things you can do and play in this format, which is why I think you'd have a great experience doing so. So I'll put links to that in the description below, and then I'll also put a link to my introduction to Tengu Plant format video. That video in-depth describes everything you need to know about Tengu Plant format, and just how important everything is, so that way you don't get caught up bandwagoning certain things. Like for example, people think that Vanity's Emptiness is at 3 in this format, and they think that it's a really good card, and it's actually just a really bad card in Tengu Plant format. Like nobody plays it because it doesn't function the same, especially with people maining 2 to 3 MST in every deck. So it's just not that good, and decks are a lot less special summon reliant. So to avoid getting caught in some of those logical traps that people see when they look at the format, just from the outside looking in, their initial point of view, take a look at my introduction to the format. I'll put a link to that in the description. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you think of any other decks that are good to play when making that switch, especially cheaply, especially if maybe you've done it yourself. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. But thank you so much for watching. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and have a great time doing today.